Welcome viewers to another episode of Exposure TV. Actually, this is our first program for at least 6 months. So we have started now to create a whole new season of shows for your research. As you remember, we were on the air earlier this year. We presented to you a whole bunch of subjects to study, whether it be UFOs or harmonics, pyramids on Mars, conspiracies, the New World Order. All of these kinds of subjects are covered by Exposure Television. Remember, the only program on this planet that lets you know the things that you're not supposed to know about. We're actually very happy because our program, thanks to all of the hard work at our studio, Robotnik in Amsterdam, and also colleagues over in Romania, we have finally got Exposure Television on the air in Bucharest. So actually with this program I'd like to say welcome to all of the people in Bucharest who will be watching this program. We are also doing some negotiations with the local station in Brisbane in Australia, and we hope also in the very near future to have our program being aired there. So at the moment we're in 2 countries and hopefully very soon 3. A little bit of news before I start again, because this is our new show for our new season. Exposure magazine is back. Some of you have remembered and have been told that it changed its name. I'll fill you in on a few details about that a little bit later in the program. But this is the new magazine. I don't know if we can get that on the camera. Exposure magazine, that's the new one. It's 64 pages on white paper with colour photographs. One of the major feature articles in this particular edition is the pyramids in China, which we're going to be discussing today with our special guest, Australian researcher Paul White. The magazine is full of information from the Roswell UFO crash and the latest details on that, and right into the heart of the occult roots of the New World Order. There's some excellent information in that's available from our office in Snake in the Netherlands, which I will give out the details for that, so you'll be able to call them. Or you can of course subscribe direct to Australia, but keep in mind our office in Holland handles most of our European work. Some of you have seen a magazine that was presented to you called Frontier 2000 magazine. This magazine was presented to you as Exposure magazine. The original idea was that this magazine should be Exposure magazine, but it is not. The reason for it, very, very short, and if you'd like further details you can contact me personally at our Australian address and telephone number, is that this magazine is not publishing the information that it was designed to do. Hence we've gone back into print in Australia. We do print from Australia, as I said, with a colour magazine, colour photographs, and that's available at the end of the program. Getting on to the research today, I've been over here now in Australia for 3 months, and we'll be doing our new shows from based in Australia, having them broadcast in Amsterdam. We're going to go now into our interview basically with Australian researcher Paul White. And basically, Paul, you have been producing films. He's a film producer researching the harmonic and the world grid connection along the lines of Captain Bruce Cathey in New Zealand. Tell me a little bit about who is Paul White, what is your work, what is your research?
Well, David, it's a pleasure to be here. This whole pyramids thing has really become the focus of our research, and how it ultimately led to the whole thing that's emerged about the Earth energy grid. So we became fascinated by the grid in the late 70s and the early 80s, and in our case were working with local Aboriginal elders who were coming out with remarkable references to pyramids and visitations by ancient peoples in Australia and that sort of thing. And we ended up meeting with an elder on the north coast of New South Wales that told us an extraordinary tale, the creation story of her people in fact, that described them coming from a destroyed homeland in the stars. And she said that when they arrived as 7 tribes on this planet, they built a circle of pyramids around the world to protect and energise the world, she said, so that what happened before wouldn't happen again. Now, I was really quite stunned by this because these people were actually describing descent from the pyramid builders and also making some sort of reference to a worldwide pyramid system. This is the intriguing thing about the whole pyramid business, is that pyramids have been beginning to turn up all over the world. And as the original researchers discovered, pyramids and temple structures around the world, showed me some footage earlier on of these pyramids that they've found in China. Mm-hmm. And that fascinates me no end because a lot of our work has been looking for pyramids in Australia. The reason being the original story we were told by Aboriginal people about some sort of worldwide paradigm of pyramids. And subsequently, grid researchers around the world have begun to find more and more ancient structures on this grid paradigm. Once the grid was lined up with the Giza Pyramid, Stonehenge and certain famous structures, researchers then found by extrapolating that map onto maps of their own countries and going to the grid intersection points that they too were beginning to find strange archaeological anomalies at these places. And we became fascinated to start applying this to Australia because Australia was the oldest country in the world and they were finding ancient structures everywhere else, so it seemed likely that we'd find something here. And indeed, as we started to explore following the grid maps locally, we began to find a variety of strange anomalies around Australia.
Can you explain a little bit, I'm sorry to cut in, but
sure. Can
you explain a little bit about what is this grid that you're talking about for our viewers?
Okay, all right.
What is it? You're talking about a map and a world and
all right.
pyramids.
All right, we'll take it from the top. The whole thing's grown out of the pyramid enigma, and in the 1960s, researchers both in the US and in the USSR began to plot the, how would you put it? The researchers in Russia found that all of the ancient temple sites and historical places were placed geometrically equidistant to each other around the world.
Like in, basically summing it up in layman's terms, put in a particular position for a various reason?
Well, they found that if you began to draw lines between the different historical sites on large maps, that these lines formed even and repeating giant pyramid patterns, that there was a recurring tetrahedral geometry, they call it, a recurring pyramid pattern that placed all of these structures geometrically equidistant following this recurring geometry.
What benefit would that be? Why would somebody place a pyramid, 1,000 kilometres apart?
Exactly so. It was almost like the remains of some scientific instrument laying damaged across the world's landscape. But it all started to correlate. It took a lot of other researchers and feeding the whole thing together before a picture started to form. We had researchers like Ivan Sanderson in the States, who was more devoted to magnetic and gravity anomalies around the Earth, places like the Bermuda Triangle. And it turns out there's a number of such places around the world where you get disappearing planes, boats and people.
Yeah, I've heard about that, yeah.
And when it's analysed closely with the proper equipment, you find aberrations in the local gravity field and various sorts of magnetic aberrations and so forth. And often indigenous people living near these areas have all sorts of stories about gods from the sky and strange lights and all kinds of...
aliens. A bit like Eric von Daniken has, he used to put out a lot of this stuff about the ancient astronauts back in the 60s.
Well, it's not necessarily aliens. When you come to Australia, they're calling them sacred sites, the local people calling them dreaming places.
The Aboriginal
more often
people,
than not. Yeah. So it was really, why were all of these ancient structures so placed was the big question. And it's only been gradually, with a lot of different researchers correlating what they've been finding, that it gradually emerges that the pyramid structures that we've been able to look at in the South Americas and in Egypt and places like that seem to be some kind of giant geophysical computers that are carefully keyed into the Earth's energies and to encode the size and circumference and various aspects of the Earth. And ultimately it was discovered that this grid pattern actually was perfectly in line with the Earth's own biomagnetic field. So what we've got is a picture of the Earth's biomagnetic field in the placement of these devices and the energy paradigm that they're placed upon. And when you start correlating it with the mythologies of Australia or China, in China they call these energy lines the dragon paths, and in Australia they call them the song lines, and in Europe they're generally referred to as ley lines. Well, these are actually the pulsing energy meridians through the landscape, like the acupuncture lines on the human body. And where they intersect, you get these energy swirls or vortexes, just the same as in the energy grid, the electrical grid of any large city. And you get these electrical eddies throughout the grid system.
Is that, like, does that have anything to do with the crop circles? Like, I've been researching crop circles. I've visited around about 200 of them throughout, you know, Europe and the UK. But what's always intrigued me is a lot of people go there with divining rods, which in Dutch that's wikkelroutes, and divine the ley lines to see if it fits onto some magnetic, or comes onto some magnetic vortex. Is that sort of what you're talking about? Is there any relation there?
Yeah, the whole thing is basically the Earth's magnetic field, and it's been found curiously that all of these cross circle designs appear on or adjacent to the energy grid intersection points. What's interesting about the English ones is, similar to Australia and other places, they're always just plain circles. And it wasn't until hippies and New Age people began gathering at a lot of the famous sacred sites like Stonehenge and Glastonbury and the like, and began doing various sorts of ancient experiments, let's call them, that suddenly the crop circle designs that were appearing around the country began to assume these complex geometries. And it's only with subsequent computer studies that it's beginning to look as if the crop circles are actually cross-section prints of harmonic waveform patterns that pulse through what the Aborigines call the song lines, that pulse through the ley lines as energy pulses that somehow punch up through the ground at the ley line grid points. And when the crops are really damp early in the morning, you've actually got an electrostatic print of this harmonic waveform punching up through the ground. And so when you start running computer animations, you can turn that print around sideways and get a third-dimensional waveform. So in fact, what we call mandalas and things like that are actually cross-section views of electromagnetic tubes of energy. You know, it's just that we're used to seeing waveforms on an old-fashioned oscilloscope as two-dimensional sine waves, but in fact they're they're circular, vortex-shaped energy tubes, and when they punch up through the ground, you've got a cross-section view of one of those, revealing these elaborate geometries that seem to be elaborately and intelligently contrived. But what we're now finding is if our best instruments are turned on the sky, we see an array of complex and intelligent patterns. And if our best instruments are turned on microscopic reality, we see the same recurring geometries and intelligent patterns. So it's very hard for scientists to argue that there isn't an intelligence behind all of this, you know.
Yeah. I wanted to also ask you concerning the face and the pyramids on Mars. Now, most of you know CNI, Contact Network International, has been doing major research on that in Europe, and our contacts over in England with David Percy, who was here last year for our conference in Amsterdam. The information there, basically, as we all know, what was up to date is that the Mars Observer last October in 1994 had been disconnected suddenly. But the actual face, basically what it is, it's a face like, or a sphinx-like figure that they've found on the planet Mars, and not 10 miles away they've actually found pyramid structures. Now, what sort of research have you done in regards to your research, Paul, here in Australia, on the other side of the world? I mean, we hear a lot about what Americans have done and what Europeans have done, but what's the Australian situation?
Basically, I published the first articles in the world about the pyramids on Mars and the face on Mars after interviewing Dr. Jim Hurtak in 1984. And that, at the same time, then stirred the making of a television documentary by Bill Payne of Channel 10 in Sydney. who made a 1-hour documentary about the face on Mars.
I've actually seen one of your old magazines you used to publish called Maggie's Farm, and that actually had a photo in it. I think that was from 1985.
That's correct, yes.
Long before Richard over in the States, Richard Hoagland, had even gotten onto this.
Well, long before a lot of people heard about it, in fact. When the news first came out about it, most people were just shocked into disbelief. It really does run contrary to the dominant paradigm that we're the only intelligent in the universe. And
God help us all if it gets proven.
Certainly the solar system, yes, indeed. And because our research was so much to do with the Earth energy grid, and we were actively looking for pyramids around the world and in our own country, collecting any research about it, we were totally fascinated by Dr. Hertak turning up in Sydney and doing a full exposition on the pyramids on Mars. The pictures, everything was just stunning. But what deal was that there wasn't just this energy paradigm on Earth. And the good doctor then went on to describe some extraordinary discoveries and information around the world about this, where he'd been touring around with a lot of high-tech NASA equipment and top specialists like the late Werner von Braun and others, and they began
the father of modern rocketry, actually.
Exactly. They began to do extensive research in depth at a lot of the pyramidal sites around the world. As a result, really, of their discovery of the pyramids in the 1976 Mariner space photographs, which NASA to this day still refuses to acknowledge, as if it's somehow patently absurd to even think about. However, the doctor went on to explain a lot of the research around the Earth and how it seemed to indicate the existence of a worldwide temple system in the prehistoric past that somehow seemed to use some kind of vibrational science to link all the tectonic plates of the Earth in some sort of vibrational linkage. And he went on to describe material from a lot of ancient texts and ancient sources that they'd unearthed themselves that described a system of priest scientists really, who were more like master musicians or master virtuosos that were able to set up some kind of standing wave pattern between the various pyramid structures around the planet and effectively link all the tectonic plates. And that this actually overlapped into some sort of ancient science of cataclysmic geology, and that they were aware of recurring cycles in...
Were you talking about like an Armageddon or something like that? Or?
Well, yes, that it's beginning to seem from a lot of the ancient texts that the ancients weren't prophets or psychics, but that their scientists were simply recording the regular cycle of planetary movements and the like. And the whole thing about the Mayan calendar from South America and even the calendric system that's been extrapolated from the Giza pyramid is all of these references to the supposed end of time in the year 2012. So it's had a lot of researchers wondering and speculating what's so special about 2012, what's going on. Were the ancients trying to warn us about something? You know, even our own biblical revelations leans heavily on all of these references to the end times, the
apocalypse or...
The apocalypse scenario, And a lot of new evidence is now emerging that makes it seem as if there weren't really ice ages in the past, but that was simply where the North Pole and the South Poles were at that time. And a lot of the ancient texts indicate something like a regular slippage of the Earth's crust that displaces everything and causes quite a dramatic upheaval, volcanic and otherwise, quite capable of wiping out a worldwide civilization.
How much? You know, I'm sure that the question is for the for our viewers is, how much credence should we be giving, you know, the Mayan calendar or the Bible? I mean, okay, if you're a Christian, basically you believe in the end times, the apocalypse. But I mean, come on, you know, the Mayan calendar, that was written thousands and thousands of years ago by, you know, a bunch of Indians. I mean, how much credence should we put on this? You know, I've heard all these stories about the end of the world coming in the year 2012 or May 5th, 2000.
Yeah. Well, there's a lot of people that,
you know, come on,
that presume it all to be a regular and recurring millennium fever of some sort. But it's beginning to seem that there was quite an advanced system of knowledge in the ancient past, where the Mayan calendar, when you start running it through computers, accurately measures time going back about 1.5 million years, describing sun cycles, solar cycles, lunar cycles and all, going back that period of time. And now that astronomers and specialists from other scientific disciplines have gotten into the Egyptian situation, they've now proven that the pyramids, the Giza Pyramid Complex, is in fact a star map of the sky from the year 10,500 BC. So they're clearly much older than the Egyptian civilization, but more importantly, bespeak the existence of an advanced civilization in the ancient past that were able to build 2.5 million ton structures with a precision that we can't match to this day. And further, we're now finding extraordinary geometries, mathematics, and quite sophisticated scientific data encoded into these structures that now leads to speculation about some kind of high technology way beyond machines with moving parts and the like as we're familiar in the 20th century, but something far more sophisticated. And then in turn, this whole business of the pyramid complexes being laid out on a geometric paradigm worldwide seems to bespeak some kind of technology that we can't even work out what it is or what it is.
So you consider the Mayan calendar actually even more accurate than our Roman calendar?
Well, certainly. The Roman calendar is quite silly. It measures a mythical time period from a mythical spiritual master a couple of thousand years back. You know, I think the Jewish people have the only true calendar in the world, which is based on the original Sumerian calendar, which simply measures civilization from the time of the flood, a period of about nearing 6,000 years, which is what brings us back to this recurring sort of clues that we're getting from a lot of the ancient text and ancient time measurement systems, that there was a major worldwide disaster approximately 6.5 to several thousand years ago that destroyed world civilization as we know it. And we're now finding from a correlation of mythologies and things around the world that there were some 408 stories of a deluge all around the world.
Well, I mean, the Aboriginals are here in Australia.
The Aboriginals here in Australia, the indigenous populations of New Zealand, Polynesian Islands, the South Americans, even the Eskimos have
Well, I would like to say something about that, just for the sake of the Dutch. I don't know if you've ever heard of the book, the Olinda book, right? Now that's actually a book that's written in Friesland, in the museum today in Leeuwarden. I was having a chat last year in Holland with David Childress when he was over for his visit, and the contents of the Olinda book, the program on this last year, actually talks about a flood and the origins of the Frisian people coming out of a hollow earth. Now this book is 600 years old, 700 years old.
That's really excellent.
Right?
David.
And
That's
it's
really
been put into the museum there, and where they've come from, which they got their teachings and doctrines from Atlantis, which really ties in to what you mentioned before about the actual cataclysms that occurred when the Mayans and the Egyptians basically vanished in thin air off the face of the planet. That's
Yes. Well,
there are still no explanations why these civilizations just suddenly disappeared. Correct me if I'm wrong.
well, that's right. And we're finding that a lot of the ancient so-called Mayan ruins and the Egyptian ruins, especially the pyramidal complexes, they're not only accurate star maps, but they map the entire precessional cycle of our planets, of our solar system's orbit around galaxy centre.
What do you mean by star map? Can you explain that a little bit?
Well, the whole thing codes the precession of the equinoxes. It describes the 26,000 year zodiacal cycle of our solar system's orbit around the Pleiades, and points to certain changes that occur regularly, like clockwork, along that cyclic orbit, when there's a certain evil and inauspicious coincidence of factors, those factors being planets lining up in our solar system, the elongation of our orbit, and the tilt of our planet. Now, it's speculated by many, and increasingly, that a combination of these factors could be sufficient to cause a major crustal slippage, which would result in the North Pole slipping some few thousand kilometres to the west, to the south, or whatever.
And do you think that's quite feasible, or is that realistically a possibility that this can happen?
Well, one of the big enigmas of modern times, and a lot of people know about this one, is the famous Prairie map Persian commander from 1515. It's a spherical projection map of the Earth with a perfect picture of Antarctica, ice-free, with an accurately mapped coastline that NASA only completed in the 1970s. With
That map actually, I think, was found in Turkey.
They've now found a number of different maps that show not only Antarctica ice-free, but in different stages of glaciation.
Yeah, there was, in Istanbul, there was actually a map they found there that had Antarctica on it that was ice-free, as well as the map of Australia in the 14th century.
Well,
which is very interesting because the very famous Captain Cook, right, has claimed, that he had discovered Australia, and of course in our history it's written down that that's why I call him Captain Cook, because he really
our research
discovered Australia,
We've found that Australia turns up on the map of Eratosthenes, the Greek, in 239 BC, actually called Osseo, for crying out loud. So there certainly are some extraordinary evidences of an ancient people having mapped the world, but interestingly they mapped a world that doesn't look like the one we now live in. The Antarctica is completely covered with ice, and we've been long told it's been covered with ice for millions of years. But now new research tends to indicate the ice could possibly have been there only 6 or several thousand years, and it's beginning to look likely that the North Pole may have been a couple of thousand kilometres further south, only 6,000 or 7,000 years ago. So we've got a lot of people really looking at the ancient myths and legends now, going, well, okay, what was happening here? Is it feasible that there was a major crustal slippage only about 6,000 or 7,000 years ago that destroyed world civilization? What would be the scenario? If the crust slipped, you'd have major cataclysmic activity. You'd have whole areas of land inundated, dropping into the sea, being pushed up out of the sea. You'd have all kinds of crustal displacement. And most importantly, you'd have major volcanic activity.
Which is actually a lot of the signs you've said, we are having them today, in this last century.
Well, what's really concerning is given the Mayan calendar and other indicators, is that we're running very close to the end of a 6,500 year cycle as we speak. And it's measurable that earthquake activity's increased 960% just in the last 10 years. And the Earth wobble seems to be increasing, and this is one of the factors that most concerns our scientists.
Which could cause a pole shift.
Which could cause a pole shift. And by a pole shift, we basically mean the Earth's magnetic field flipping. And when that flip occurs, then the crust goes through a certain amount of slippage. It doesn't actually mean that north and south poles, the whole planet spins upside down. But with this magnetic field reversal, which interestingly now they've studied a lot of rock core samples around the world, and they find that there's been 171 magnetic field reversals on the planet as far back as their instruments can reach. And just like measuring tree rings, they find that these magnetic reversals are all exactly 13,500 years apart, which is the half point on that 26,000 year cycle. So already we can see some regular pattern. Plus, there was a major field reversal 6,500 years ago on the rock record, which shows up as an anomaly. All the rest are exactly 13,500 years apart, but for this anomaly 6,000 years ago.
Researchers Richard Hoagland and John West. Richard Hoagland's basically brought it out into the open, but John West, he's an archaeologist over in the States, I'm quite sure you've heard of his name.
Yeah.
He's done some very good work on his documentaries, The Age of the Sphinx, for example, and he's proven, even in the United Nations, that the Sphinx is actually around, correct me if I'm wrong, around about 12 to 14,000 years, or well above 10,000 years. It's actually 5 to 7,000 years older than we have been told in our history books. And what's very interesting is that the Sphinx, according to John's research, had been buried for so many years under the sands around the Nile River. It used to be a very tropical, lush green area, and it's one of the last relics of Atlantis here on the Earth. And on top of all of this, where the erosion goes around the Sphinx, they've proven that it's not made from wind, but actually water, where the Sphinx approximately 6,000 years ago had been submerged around a washing waves of salt water.
Well, that's very interesting.
That really confirms a lot of what you're saying.
Well, they've certainly found a 200-foot high watermark on the side of the Giza pyramid. So there's strong evidence to indicate the whole complex was underwater at some time. And then John West has found deeply engraved rivulet patterns, water-running patterns on the back of the Sphinx that could only be made by heavy torrential rain over a number of thousands of years, which hasn't rained like that in Egypt for some several thousand years. So there's quite a lot of interesting evidence that now makes it quite certain that the pyramids and the Sphinx complex are some several thousand years older than Egypt. So what we're getting is a gathering of evidence that there was an advanced civilization in the ancient past that was apparently totally destroyed. And there seems to be a lot of resistance on the part of the world academic community to accept this in any way, shape or form. They want to hold on to the notion that we developed from the Stone Age 6,000 years ago or something, you know. So that finding anomalous artefacts around the planet's almost become a cause for a lot of people to demonstrate that there is something more interesting going on than just recent civilization. Even just DNA tests demonstrate that our species, Homo sapiens sapien, has been around for 50,000 to 100,000 years. That is, people who look exactly like you and I, if they were clean-shaven and dressed in modern clothes, you'd pass them in the street without blinking. So that's an awful lot of time for us to have been around as a species, and there's quite a lot of room for a lot of things to have happened. So that's what's interesting about these pyramids that have now been discovered in China. They're of an extremely ancient sort, and yet from the pictures clearly laid out in similar star-type patterns and designs as the Egyptian complex, and more importantly are exactly on a major grid intersection point on the Xingu Plateau that we've been aware of since 1984. So it was through Dr. Hertak again and again from NASA space photographs that the Chinese pyramids were discovered, and they even realised they were there. And subsequently they're now discovering many others in South America and even Australia. Our most recent film here has been able to show footage of a group of pyramids in the Australian Alps. In this case, not terribly large ones. They're only about 9 to 10 metres tall, but they're cut out of solid granite in a single piece. They're not even built in blocks or chips in the conventional fashion. And another local researcher, Rex Gilroy, who's been around a lot of years, has just discovered a pyramid inland from Cape York in northern Australia. In this case, a stepped pyramid, more of the Sumerian type.
Like a ziggurat type.
Ziggurat type, yes.
Type of thing, yeah.
And only yesterday I went to the Gympie area in Queensland to investigate a steeped pyramid there. And in that case we're in touch with researchers who have produced turn-of-the-century photographs of complete Easter Island statues, carved temple statue heads. And yesterday we're showing us drawings of fallen carved stela or spikes of stone with complete hieroglyphic carvings down the four sides that look to be something very similar to a kind of a Sumerian, Egyptian sort of collage, probably. Do
you have any of those hieroglyphs on photo with you, or did you happen to bring any of those along?
The ones from yesterday?
The ones they've found in Australia, here in New South Wales?
Well, I've got it all on video.
Maybe next time what we'll do is next interview.
Yeah,
we'd like to present a little bit of that for the public.
Yeah, we could give you some excerpts and show you some of the stuff that's happening in Australia. But why it's exciting for us as Australians is that this begins to verify the whole paradigm of a worldwide energy system. And the research into the temple structures and into the pyramid structures has really been quite extraordinary. Why we now feel that they're geophysical computers is some of the research from Dr. Hertak and his colleagues at the different pyramidal sites, where they were able to conduct some pretty unusual experiments in sound and harmonics. Many of us have heard of Paul Horn and such personalities going to the Giza pyramid and playing their flutes or whatever. But it's now been discovered that many of the ancient divine names in the original mother tongues actually encode particular sound equations.
Like harmonic vibrations? Or
frequency patterns are encoded into these names. And Dr. Hertak has demonstrated remarkable footage of them demonstrating this voice activation aspect of the pyramids. using their NASA equipment, they were able to establish a variety of harmonically tuned cavities and rooms throughout the pyramid structure, actually tuned to Bruce Cathy type harmonic mathematics. So you'd have cavities tuned to the 144 harmonic of light and others tuned to other kinds of waveforms, some of which were unfamiliar to the researchers. So they designed experiments where they were able to position themselves above and on top of the pyramid complex of Tikal in Guatemala, and they found that by intoning the name of God out loud in Hebrew Sumerian, that it was picked up by the pyramid structures and resonated through a series of chambers that then picked it up as a sound crescendo that was reverberated by the pyramids. And the whole pyramid structures began to reverberate, putting out a low rumbling sound, and visible standing waves of light formed above the pyramids, glowing in the air. And other material Dr. Hurtak showed us had them repeat the same experiments at the Giza pyramids, where he's found the king's chamber to actually be tuned to the frequency of the human heart, and the coffer is part of the tuning equipment of that room. And turning off all the lights, the researchers standing within the king's coffer intone the name of God, or one of the divine names in ancient Egyptian, and the whole room lit up like a laser display with standing waves of light in the air so bright they were able to take photographs of each other's shining faces just by the light of these standing waves. And subsequently the NASA equipment established that there were crystalline formations also mounted in the masonry of the walls that were apparently tuned to the frequency of the divine name. So the whole complex was in fact voice activated, and you can well imagine the ancient priest scientists standing within the central chamber intoning specific frequencies that were magnified to an incredible degree and broadcast out across the plains of ancient Egypt, so that these were remarkable structures that had a variety of applications, some of which are still beyond our ken.
Yeah, there's been a lot of research actually into the actual building of the pyramids. What I've read up on, that they actually used frequencies to levitate the stones, vibrational frequencies, to put the pyramids together. I mean, the establishment has been telling us and lying to us for, well, at least this century, if not longer, concerning that the pyramids were built by thousands and thousands of slaves. And yet there is really indirectly no evidence of that, and quite to the contrary, the evidence indicates more along the lines of what we've been discussing.
Well, to be fair to our own civilisation, I guess it's got to be understood that we've just jumped from the horse and cart to walking on the moon in 80 years or so.
And even that's been questioned.
Yes, so from a lot of standards, we're really quite a young and primitive civilisation. And a lot of the research, a lot of the Egyptology was really done early in this century, when we ourselves had a less sophisticated and a less educated mindset. There's a lot of Egyptologists that still hold on to the absurd notion that the pyramids were tombs, and yet there's never been a single body found in any of the 3rd or 4th dynasty pyramids, you know. And yet, because the early Egyptologists were so convinced of that, that it became part of the mythos of Egyptology. And there were certain things found and translated in the early days that they simply couldn't understand. And the technology at the time wasn't up to creating such structures. So because even in 1920 we thought we were the greatest civilization ever produced, we had to figure out that it took them 500,000 slaves, 20 years, with mules and with ropes. Must have been how these pyramids were built, because they were obviously built by a primitive people way behind us in terms of our concept of progress. The notion that for a moment any of these primitive peoples could have been more advanced than ourselves was just too much for the mind to take.
Especially, I think, things have changed a lot today too, because, you know, the old boys network, or the old boys mindset on how things are and have been, is definitely changing. Religion is breaking down, our political and democratic structures are breaking down, because basically their way has not worked. Yet the alternative, especially alternative media, like for example Exposure Television, and our magazine and your work and your films that you put out, is really getting that information out there and helping the people to realise that there are alternative viewpoints, and a lot more to it. I really think that that's had a great, vast impact worldwide. Do you feel that sort of progress as well? Or?
Yes, I think there has been quite a breakthrough in recent times because of the new mindset that's emerging. There's been a tremendous archaic revival, a revival of interest in ancient knowledge and ancient science and the like, at the same time as which there's been a lot of attention coming from the world indigenous peoples with their ancient stories and ancient mythology. And indeed, a lot of what we're finding in the ancient knowledge is almost like an ancient jigsaw puzzle, and we're gradually assembling the clues, you know, about what's really happening. And that's why I feel that some of the ancient structures that were so carefully laid out, almost like the Giza Pyramid, like a giant 3D interactive puzzle out there on the desert for a future humanity to become intelligent enough to figure out, you know, and that they were all somehow directed to teach us about the precession of the equinoxes and this notion of a recurring cataclysm. And I think to encourage the idea of cataclysmic geology, in other words, what can we do about the Earth situation? If there's an increase in earthquakes, and if all of this is true and there is some kind of problem with the planet coming up, what do we do about it? Well, I think there's really a lot to be learned from the ancient knowledge, especially to do with this ancient temple system. Is some of what Dr. Hertak and his colleagues have discovered is real, is correct? Well, it really does look like that it was once possible to harmonically tune the entire planet like a giant bell or something. And by so tuning the tectonic plates that we could actually dampen or control tectonic activity on this planet. Even just on a simple level, structures like Stonehenge, the prehistoric towers placed on the grid points all over countries like Ireland, represent finely tuned harmonic structures like acupuncture needles into the grid points of the Earth. And they pick up the outflowing energy and convert the electromagnetic waves into giant mandala-shaped energy fields across the local environment, sometimes reaching for 20 or 30 kilometres. And researchers found that seed germination rates are increased within that field, crystalline growth rates, healthier crops, healthier babies, even the microclimate of the area is improved. So you can imagine what a network of such, even just small structures across a single country could do to bioengineer the bioscape of that country. Yeah. So a worldwide system that was able to send carefully modulated electromagnetic waves all around the planet, energising and protecting it in exactly the way the Aboriginal elders described, does seem to be emerging as a very real possibility of an ancient science that could be recreated.
Well, we have to wind up in a few moments. What I did want to do just briefly before we go is you've seen the film from the underwater pyramid at Bimini.
Yes. Right?
And you have just cited now you want about the fourth or the fifth person in this country to see the pyramid films of China, the Chinese pyramids in Shenzhen. But what we want to do now is we're going to go for around about a 1 minute film break. We're going to present now for the next 60 seconds or so some very short clips of the pyramids in China and the pyramid that has been discovered in Bimini in the United States off the coast of Florida, correct me if I'm wrong, underwater of a ziggurat